Hello and welcome. In this video segment we'll explore some of the different methods and techniques for constructing lines. On the left of the screen I have 5 green lines that I will recreate on the right side of the screen using line endpoint and line parallel. Now before we start to create these lines, let's check out the X and Y axis. As you look at the screen, the X axis is from left to right and the Y-axis is laying vertically on the screen. The Z-axis is pointing straight at you. Now the origin, our X0, Y0, Z0, is positioned at the center of this grid on the right hand side. Now for the left hand example, the origin is simulated here at the intersection of these lines. The first line to be created is the polar line. Now the first endpoint is at the origin, X0, Y0, Z0. The angle is at minus 25 degrees and the length is 3 inches. The second line is a vertical line and it's 1 inch to the right of the Y-axis. Now the third line is a horizontal line and it sits 1.5 above the X-axis. Now the fourth line is created by the input of the coordinates of each endpoint. The last line is created parallel to an existing line and the distance is 0.5. Now let's start to create the polar line. Up in the menu bar in Create we have lines and 5 different options. I'm just going to click on Create. Now just down below in the Sketcher toolbar we have the same options. I'm going to select Create Line Endpoint. Now before we continue, if you just look over to the right in the MRU right at the very top, I could have selected this icon for Create Line Endpoint. Now here's my first prompt, specify the first endpoint. Well, I could move up to the auto cursor ribbon bar and input X0, Y0, Z0, but what I'm going to do is just slide off to the right, open up this drop down, and at the very top I'm going to select origin. So here we are, our first endpoint is at X0, Y0, Z0. Now specify the second endpoint. What I'm going to do is move up to the ribbon bar and click in the white space for length. The length of this line is 3. I'm going to hit the tab button on my keyboard and here we are over in the right in the angle section. The angle is minus 25 degrees and I'm going to hit enter. And there's our line. Now instead of putting in minus 25, I could have put in positive 335 degrees. Now before we move on forward, let's review the buttons in the line ribbon bar. Way over on the left, this button will allow us to edit the first endpoint, and just to the right, this will allow us to edit the second endpoint. Now just to the right is multi-line. Now this lets you create multiple lines connected at their endpoints. You can enter a point for the first endpoint of the first line and then a point for the second endpoint of the line. That second point becomes the first endpoint of the next line that you create. More on multi-line later on in this video. Now what I'm going to do is slide on to the right. This is the section for length. Next door, angle. Now as we slide over to the right, this button will allow me to create vertical lines. Just to the right, horizontal lines. Moving over to the right will allow us to create tangent lines. Now just to the right is the apply button, and in a moment I'm going to click on that to allow us to move on to create some more lines. Now if it was time to leave this command, I could press on OK. Now right at the very end is the question mark for help. So let's go back to the left and hit apply. Now the next line that we're going to create is this vertical line. So what I'm going to do is go up and select the vertical button on the ribbon bar. Now for this prompt, specify the first endpoint. I'm going to pick a point here, and then for the second point I'm going to slide on down and pick this point. Now the prompt, enter the X coordinate. What I'm going to do is type in 1 and then hit enter. Now to move on to the next stage, let's hit apply, and there's our line. Now the next line is this horizontal line that sits 1.5 inches above the x-axis. So back up to the ribbon bar, I'm going to select horizontal. When prompted for the first endpoint, I'm going to pick a point here. I'm going to slide off to the left and pick a point here. Now for this prompt, enter the Y coordinate. What I need to do is type in 1.5 and then hit enter. And there's our line. Back up to the ribbon bar, I'm going to hit apply. Now let's look at this next line. We're going to create this line using endpoints. It's got a start point and an end point. So specify the first endpoint. I'm going to move up to the auto cursor ribbon bar, click in this white space for the X value. Now the X value is X minus 1.25. I'm going to hit tab, and here we are in the Y section. Now the Y value is minus 0.5. I'm going to hit tab, and Z is 0. I'm just going to hit enter. Now as you can see, as I move the cursor around, we're locked in to horizontal. I'm going to go back up to the ribbon bar and click on the horizontal button to deactivate it. Now the next endpoint, what I'm going to do is move up to the auto cursor ribbon bar and click on fast point, and I'm going to type in the X and Y values. So the X is minus 2.5, comma, and the Y value is minus 1.75, and I'm just going to hit enter. And there's our line. Now another way of moving into fast point is just by hitting the space bar on your keyboard. Everything looks good here, so what I'm going to do is move up to the ribbon bar and pick OK. Now the next line we're going to create is a parallel line, and it's parallel to the last line we created at a distance of 0.5. So I'm going to open up, and then right at the very bottom down here, create line parallel. Now our first prompt, select a line. I'm going to select this line, and the prompt's changed. Select the point to place a parallel line through. I'm going to pick a point just below this line. Now let's move up to the ribbon bar, and in the distance section, what I'm going to do is type in 0.5 and then hit enter. Now just to the left is the flip button. I'm going to flip on it. As you can see, the line's flipped over. I'm going to hit flip one more time. Now we've got two lines, and both these lines are 0.5 away from this green line. I'm going to hit flip again, and that's the line that I want. So I'm going to move on up now and pick on OK. What I'm doing right now is hitting the up arrow key on my keyboard to move up to the next example. I have a mouse with a wheel on it, and what I'm doing is rolling the wheel on my mouse forwards to zoom in a little closer. So that looks good. In this example, what we're going to do is be creating lines using multi-line, and we'll also explore the functionality of auto cursor. Now on the left hand side we have a large green square and a smaller green square, which we're going to duplicate over here using multi-line. So look, let's move into create line endpoint. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is pick on multi-line. Now specify the first endpoint. As I move over the top of this circle, you can see there is a visual cue that I'm going to snap to the quadrant point on this circle. If I move over to the left, there's a visual cue for midpoint, and if I move to the center of this circle, there's a visual cue that I'm going to snap to the center of this arc. What I'm going to do next is right mouse click, and right down the bottom here I'm going to select auto cursor. Now all the auto cursor settings are turned on. I'm going to click on the disable all button, all turned off now, and pick OK. Now if I move over the top of this circle, the side, center, no visual cues whatsoever. So look, let's right mouse click again. Let's move into auto cursor, and what I'm going to do is put a check against endpoint and put a check against quadrant, and that's all. Just these two options, endpoint and quadrant. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom. I'm finished here, and I'm going to pick OK. Now for the prompt, specify the first endpoint. As I move up to the top of the circle, there's my visual cue for quadrant. I'm going to pick it. As I move on down to the left, there's my visual cue for quadrant. I'm going to pick on down the very bottom, and there's another visual cue that pops up. I'm going to pick it. Over onto the right, there's the visual cue for endpoint. I'm going to pick it, and let's move on back to the top, and there's my visual cue for endpoint. Now in this situation there is more than one point that lies within the detection range of the cursor, endpoint and quadrant. Now in these cases auto cursor uses a specific order to detect and snap to points. Now the order starts with point entities, then endpoints of curves or lines, then it moves on to midpoints, and then next it moves on to quadrants. So what's happening here is I only have quadrant and endpoint turned on, but endpoint is closer up the top of the list. Now if I wanted to specifically pick the quadrant point, what I need to do is move up to the auto cursor ribbon bar. I'm going to open up this drop down, and here we have a variety of different options for snapping to particular points. What I'm going to do is pick quadrant. Now select an arc. I'm going to pick this arc, and as you can see it's snapped to the top there. I'm going to pick OK. Now let's move over to the left, and the next lines that I'm going to create is this small square. So let's go back up again. I'm going to hit the toolbar icon, create line endpoint. The first thing I'm going to do is check mark multi-line. Now this line on the left, it goes from the midpoint to midpoint, and as you can see, as I'm hovering over the midpoint of this line, no visual cues for midpoint. So what I'm going to do is right mouse click. Let's go back into auto cursor again. I'm going to turn everything on, so I'm going to check enable all, and everything has got check marks on it, so it looks good here. I'm going to pick OK. Now watch as I move over, there's the visual cue for midpoint. I'm going to click on it. Now for the second endpoint, as I move on over, there's the visual cue for quadrant. That's tangent, and there's my cue for midpoint. So I'm going to pick it. I'm going to slide on down. There's my visual cue for midpoint. I'm going to pick it. That's tangent, don't want that. As I move on over, there's my visual cue for midpoint. Got it. I'm going to pick it, and let's move on up, and there's my visual cue for endpoint. Perfect. I'm done here. So back up to the ribbon bar, and pick OK. Now let's go back up, open up this drop down. The next one on the list, create line closest. So I'm going to click on it. This function creates a line between two entities at the closest intersection. So what I'm going to do is, when prompted, select line, arc or spline. I'm going to pick this circle on the left and then move over to the right, and I'll pick this line. And there's the line between the small circle and the big circle. And as you can see, there was no ribbon bar that appeared for that function. Let's go back up again now, and the next one down is create line bisect. Now this function creates a bisecting line between two existing lines. So here's my prompt, select two lines to bisect. So what I'm going to do is move on to the left here, and I'm going to pick this line, and I'll pick this line up here. Now Mastercam creates multiple possibilities for bisecting lines, and I'm being prompted to select the ones I want to keep. For example, here's one line, the second one, third, and here's the fourth line. So what I'd like to do is keep this line. So I'm going to pick on it. Just going to move on up and do a repaint. And I'm finished here. So I'm going to pick OK on the ribbon bar. Let's open up. Next on the list, create line perpendicular. Now we can use this function to create a line perpendicular to existing entities by selecting an existing line, an arc or a spline, and then clicking in the graphics window to create an endpoint. So for this first prompt, I'm going to pick this line, and now sketch a point. What I'm going to do is move on down and snap to this point. Now let's just move up to the ribbon bar, and for the length what I'm going to do is input 1, hit enter. Now let's check out the prompt on the screen. Select which line to keep. So I've got one line here and also another line up here. So I'd like to keep this line. I'm going to pick on it, and it looks good. I'm just going to move on up to the ribbon bar and pick OK. Now last one on the list, create line parallel. Now here's the prompt, select a line. So I'm going to pick this line here. Now for the next prompt, select the point to place a line through. I'm going to pick a point above. I'm going to move up to the ribbon bar, and for the distance I'm going to input 1 and then hit enter. Now if I just slide over to the left and click on the flip button, there it is. If I click it again, we got two lines now. Let's click it again. I'm going to keep this one. So I'm just going to move on up. I'm done here. I'm going to pick OK. What I'd like to do now is to move on and demonstrate tangent lines. I'm going to move up to the top and click on the toolbar icon for open. I'm going to select this Mastercam file, create lines tangent, and then at the very bottom of this dialog box I'm going to hit the open button. Now do I want to save this file? No, I'm going to pick on no. Now let's look over on the left hand side. We've got a series of lines that I'm going to duplicate on the right. For example, the line that I'm highlighting now at the bottom is a line that's tangent to this arc and this arc. Just above it, this line, same deal, it's tangent to this arc and this arc. Just above, this line is tangent to this arc. It's sitting at an angle of 10 degrees and the line is 2 inches long. If we move over to the left, this line is tangent to this arc and it's passing through the origin 0 in x, 0 in y, z, 0. Now over on the right hand side, our x0, y0, z0 is at the center of this grid, our origin. So let's move on up, open up this drop down, and I'm going to move into create line endpoint. Now up on the ribbon bar, the first thing I'm going to do is select tangent. Now the first line I'd like to create is this line. As you can see, it's tangent to this circle and this circle. But what's happening right now is there's a visual cue that I'm going to snap to this quadrant point, which I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is hold the Alt key down, and as I move over the circle now, there are no visual cues, which is perfect. So I'm going to pick this circle and then move over to the right. I'm still holding the Alt key down. I've disabled those snap points, and I'm going to pick this circle, and there it is. Let's move up now and hit apply. Next we'll put in this line. So specify the first endpoint. As you can see, it's going to snap to the quadrant point. I'm going to hold the Alt key down and no visual cues, which is good. I'm going to pick this circle on the left and then pick this guy on the right, and everything looks good. Let's move on up and pick apply. Now for the next line, it's tangent to this circle. It's sitting at 10 degrees and it has a length of 2. So specify the first endpoint. What I'm going to do is hold the Alt key down and pick the circle. When prompted for the first point, I've let go of the Alt key and I'm going to pick a point over here. Now let's move up to the ribbon bar. I'm going to click in the white space for length, and the length of this line is 2. I'm now going to hit the tab button on my keyboard, and here we are in the angle section, and the angle is 10, and I'm going to hit enter. Perfect, exactly what we want. So let's move on up to the ribbon bar and hit apply. So 3 lines so far. Let's do this one next. Now this line passes through the origin and it's tangent. So specify the first endpoint. What I'm going to do is move on up, open up this drop down and pick origin. And there it is. Now I'm going to hold my Alt key down and pick this arc. That looks good. I'm going to move on to the top here and hit apply. So there's our 1, 2, 3, 4 lines created. Now I'm done here, so I'm going to pick OK. And that finishes up our excursion of creating lines. Thanks for watching.